The chest of drawers sat in the corner of the estate attorney's conference room, like something that had wandered in from the wrong century. It was mahogany, or had been once, before decades of use had darkened the grain to the color of old bruises. Water rings marked the top surface in overlapping circles, a geology of forgotten coffee cups and whiskey glasses. The brass handles on the lower drawers had turned green at the joints, and one of them was missing entirely, or replaced by a folded piece of electrical tape that had hardened and curled with age. The appraiser, a man in his early 40s named Douglas, who wore linen blazers and spoke about furniture the way doctors spoke about difficult diagnoses, had examined it for approximately 90 seconds before writing something in his notebook and moving on. Reproduction Victorian, he'd told the room. Competent craftsmanship for its era, but not a period piece. No maker's mark of significance. Water damage on the top surface reduces value considerably. Estimated auction, $150 to $200. He'd said the number with the tone of someone who felt almost apologetic for saying it aloud. Nora Calloway had watched Douglas walk away from the chest and felt something she couldn't name settle into her sternum. Not grief exactly, more like recognition. The chest looked the way she felt standing in that conference room surrounded by her family and their lawyers and their hunger. A little damaged, a little overlooked, worth considerably less than anyone around it had decided. She was 34 years old and wore the only blazer she owned, a dark navy piece she'd bought 4 years ago for her job interview at the Millbrook Elementary School library. She had driven 90 minutes to get here in a truck that needed new brake pads, a sound she could feel more than hear every time she slowed at a light. Her daughter Gracie was with the Hendersons next door, 7 years old, and worried in the particular focused way 7-year-olds worried, which meant she'd asked twice that morning whether Mommy would come home with good news. Nora had said she didn't know, and kissed her daughter's forehead and got in the truck. The room held 12 people. Gerald Calloway, Nora's uncle, sat at the head of the table with his wife Sheila, who wore a bracelet that winked in the light whenever she moved her wrist. Gerald was 62, broad-shouldered, and had the voice of someone who'd spent decades being listened to without having to ask twice. He was a commercial real estate broker in Phoenix, had been successful by most measures, though Nora had noticed over the years that success seemed to make him hungrier rather than satisfied. He'd driven 1,500 miles to be at this table, and he had not visited his father, and Henry Calloway, in the 18 months before Henry died. Patricia Dover, Nora's aunt, sat on the other side of the table with her husband Marcus and their attorney, a young woman named Kristen, who kept a second notepad and never seemed to stop writing in it. Patricia was 58, thinner than Nora remembered, with a brittleness around the eyes that came from either too many early mornings or too many difficult conversations. She lived in Chicago and had last seen Henry at Christmas 2 years ago, a visit she had described in a family group text as exhausting and meaningful in a tone that suggested she meant only the first word. Henry Calloway had died 11 days ago at the age of 91, in his own bed, in the house in Millbrook, Tennessee, where he had lived for 63 years. His heart had given out sometime in the early morning, so Nora had found him when she came by at 8:30 with Gracie and a bag of groceries and the audiobook of a Patrick O'Brian novel they'd been working through together, 1 disc at a time for the past several months. She had been the one to call the paramedics. She had been the one to call Gerald and Patricia, standing in Henry's kitchen with Gracie pressed against her hip and her voice absolutely steady in a way she would not understand until later required something she didn't fully have. The conference room table was long enough that Nora could sit at one end and feel herself at a considerable remove from the transaction happening in the middle. Gerald's attorney was walking through the inventory. The house itself, a 4-bedroom Victorian on Sycamore Street in the older residential district of Millbrook, had been appraised at $830,000. Gerald wanted it sold and the proceeds split. Patricia wanted to buy Gerald's half and keep it, or arguing sentimental value and proximity, though she lived 800 miles away. The argument had been going on for 6 minutes and had the practiced quality of a disagreement that had already been rehearsed in phone calls and text messages before anyone arrived. The investment accounts totaled $312,000. There was a savings account with $11,000. A collection of mid-century furniture in the front parlor that Douglas estimated at $180,000 total, including a set of Stickley chairs and an arts and crafts sideboard that had made him visibly emotional in a way he'd tried to conceal. Henry's tool collection in the workshop behind the house, his truck, a 1994 Ford that ran improbably well, the jewelry box that had belonged to Henry's wife Eleanor, dead now for 22 years, which contained pieces that appraised at $68,000 and about which Patricia had already made clear she had opinions. Nora's name appeared nowhere in any of the discussions about these items. She was Henry's granddaughter, not his child, and though Henry had never written a formal will, which was a fact Gerald had disclosed with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering news he had verified and been relieved by, state intestacy law was clear. The estate passed to children first, but Nora had no legal standing to any of it. She had known this before she came. She had driven 90 minutes and worn her interview blazer because Henry had been her person, the most consistent presence in her life since her mother died when Nora was 16, the man who had called her every Sunday at noon for 18 years and told her she was doing fine, even on the years when fine was the most generous possible interpretation of her circumstances. She had come because it seemed wrong not to, and because someone who loved Henry should be in the room where his life was being divided into line items. Douglas finished the inventory. Gerald's attorney summarized the distribution proposal. Patricia's attorney offered a counter. The two sides talked at each other for another 20 minutes in the particular rhythm of people who were being paid by the hour and had all day. Nobody asked Nora anything. At some point, Gerald looked over at her, as though remembering she was there. "So, Nora," his voice had the warmth of someone performing warmth, "is there anything here you wanted to take as a keepsake? Something personal? There's no obligation, of course." Patricia made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but occupied the same space as one. Nora looked at the room, the Stickley chairs, the paintings Henry had collected over decades, mostly landscapes of places he'd never been, which he'd once told her he bought because looking at them felt like travel without the expense. The small oak writing desk in the corner where he'd kept his correspondence. Her eyes moved to the chest of drawers. She had been in Henry's bedroom hundreds of times, thousands of times, across her life. She had sat on the foot of his bed when she was 8 years old and listened to him tell stories about the Navy and the Pacific and the year he spent in the Philippines. Or she had sat in that same room at 17 when her mother died, and Henry had held her hand and said nothing at all for 45 minutes, which was exactly what she needed. She had brought Gracie there when Gracie was 3 weeks old, swaddled in a yellow blanket, and set her in Henry's arms and watched him look at his great-granddaughter with an expression that she hadn't found words for yet. The chest of drawers had been in his room for as long as she could remember. He kept his socks in the top drawer, his reading glasses in the second. The bottom drawer was where he kept the tin of peppermint candies he'd offered to Gracie every single visit since Gracie was old enough to want them. Henry would open that bottom drawer with a particular deliberateness, as though it required ceremony, and fish out the round red tin and offer it to Gracie with both hands. And Gracie would select one candy with enormous seriousness and say, "Thank you." "Great-grandpa," not with a formality that made Henry's eyes crinkle at the corners. Nora pointed. The chest of drawers. The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet, when someone has said something unexpected, but not quite interesting enough to sustain the silence for very long. Douglas checked his notepad. "Reproduction Victorian," he said again, addressing no one in particular. "Minimal value." Gerald looked at the chest, then back at Nora, and she watched him calculating whether there was anything she might know that he didn't. Then he looked at Patricia, and they conducted the brief, silent negotiation of siblings who have spent a lifetime communicating efficiently. "It's yours," Gerald said, with the expansiveness of a man who had just gotten everything he came for and could afford to be generous about the leftover. "You can have it. We'll put it in the truck before we leave." His wife Sheila made the sound of someone suppressing an editorial comment. Patricia's attorney kept writing. Patricia herself looked at the chest with an expression that contained something Nora couldn't quite read. Not longing exactly. More like the look you give something you've already decided isn't worth fighting over, but you want noted, that you'd noticed it was there. "Thank you," Nora said. She said it without inflection, the way you said things when you were trying very hard not to give anyone a reason to reconsider. Gerald's attorney cleared his throat and moved on to the matter of the house. Later, in the parking lot, while Marcus Dover helped her load the chest into the bed of her truck with the particular martyred energy of a man who had better things to do, Patricia came to stand beside Nora. She was holding a to-go cup of coffee and looking at the chest with a careful blankness. You know he was stubborn. Not Patricia's voice was the voice of someone who had decided to have a conversation they'd been planning. He could have set up proper trusts, could have made a will. "Gerald and I would have been more than fair with you, Nora. You know that." Nora thought about what more than fair meant from the perspective of someone who had just negotiated exclusive possession of an $800,000 property. She thought about Henry telling her on one of their Sunday calls, when she was going through the first year after her divorce, that fairness was a different thing than justice, and that most people who invoked one actually meant the other. "I know," she said. Patricia looked at her in the way of someone who expects more words and is slightly annoyed not to be getting them. Marcus secured the last of the rope ties across the chest, announced he was going to use the restroom, and went inside. Nora stood next to the truck and looked at the chest. Someone had left a bungee cord wrapped around the middle drawer to hold it shut. The brass handle on the third drawer, the one that had always been missing, had a fold of electrical tape over the screw hole. Henry had put that tape there himself. She had watched him do it, sitting on the floor of his bedroom with pliers and a roll of electrical tape, working with the careful, unhurried focus he brought to all repairs. "It's not broken," he'd told her then. "She just needs a placeholder until I find the right hardware." He'd said the same thing for 11 years about that missing handle, and she had understood at some point that finding the right hardware wasn't something he was actively pursuing. The placeholder was fine. The placeholder held. She drove home with the chest in the truck bed and the windows down and the radio off. The brake pads made their sound at every red light. She thought about Henry and the summer she was 11 when he had taught her to fish, not as a demonstration, but as a genuine effort to convey something he believed was important. Sitting in silence at the edge of Carver Creek for 3 hours and talking to her like she was an adult. She thought about his voice on the phone every Sunday. She thought about his eyes when he looked at Gracie. She did not cry on the drive home. She had been crying at odd times in the 11 days since finding him, unexpectedly and briefly, in the produce section of the grocery store, and once in the school library while shelving returned books, and she'd decided the unpredictability was worse than the grief itself, so she was working very hard on holding it somewhere specific inside her, where she could access it intentionally, rather than the other way around. Gracie was waiting on the porch of the rental house when she pulled in. She was wearing her Tuesday clothes, though it was Thursday, which meant she had dressed herself, and Mrs. Henderson had not interfered, and she was holding her stuffed rabbit Oliver with both arms pressed across her chest in the posture that meant she had been worrying for a while. Mommy. She came down the porch steps at a careful, controlled pace that suggested she wanted to run, but had decided running would give away how worried she'd been. Did you get anything good? Nora climbed out of the truck, and Gracie pressed into her, and Nora held her for a moment, and breathed in the smell of strawberry shampoo and plain soap, and something that was just Gracie. I got the best thing, she said. She stepped back so Gracie could see the chest in the truck bed. Gracie looked at it for a long moment. Then she climbed up onto the running board to get a better view. It smells like Great-Grandpa Henry, Gracie said. She reached out and touched the wood, and her hand was small and careful on the old dark grain, and something in Nora's chest cracked open the way glass cracks before it breaks. I know, Nora said. They got Mrs. Henderson's husband Carl to help them carry it inside, and they put it in Nora's bedroom against the wall where the light was best. And that night, after Gracie was asleep, Nora sat on the floor in front of it and looked at it for a long time. It was not a beautiful piece of furniture. It never had been, even in its best days, now which were well behind it now. But it had sat in Henry's room through 63 years of his life, and whatever that meant, it meant something she couldn't quantify and wasn't sure she needed to. She opened the bottom drawer. The candy tin was still there. She opened the tin and found 3 peppermint candies, and she ate one and thought about Gracie's formal thank you and Henry's crinkled eyes, and wondered if she had ever fully understood, while it was happening, how much all of it would matter later. She put the tin back and closed the drawer and went to bed. The chest stayed in her bedroom through October. Nora cleaned it on a Sunday afternoon, while Gracie watched a movie in the living room, using a cloth and a careful mixture of soap and water that Carl Henderson had recommended, working slowly along the grain of the wood. The water stains on the top surface didn't come out, which she had expected. They were too deep. They were part of the thing now. She was rubbing the 3rd drawer's front panel with a dry cloth when she noticed it for the first time. It was subtle enough that she understood why she'd never seen it before. The panel was fractionally thicker than it should be, relative to the drawer face. She ran her finger along the edge where the panel met the side of the drawer and felt a seam that wasn't decorative. The joints in period furniture had seams, but they had a different quality, a fitted deliberateness. This seam was different, almost uniform, almost machine precise. She pressed the panel lightly. Nothing happened. She pressed the corners, one at a time, in the way you pressed panels in old furniture that had concealed compartments, which she knew about from 34 years of reading and from a brief and specific obsession with hidden rooms and secret passages that had occupied her from age 9 to age 11 and apparently had not entirely left her. The upper left corner gave. Not much, maybe 3 millimeters, but it was a distinct yield, a compression against something spring-loaded beneath the wood. She pressed it again and held it while she pressed the lower right corner with her other hand. Derton heard a soft click that was barely a sound at all, and the panel swung inward. The hidden space behind it was roughly 8 inches deep and perhaps 14 inches wide. Built into the back of the drawer face, concealed by the panel. Someone had constructed it with care. The wood of the compartment interior planed smooth and fitted with the same precision as the latch mechanism. It smelled of cedar and something else, something dry and faintly chemical that she associated with old documents. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the opening in the wood. She was aware of several things at once. The sound of the movie in the next room, the quality of the afternoon light through the bedroom window, the roughness of the floor under her knees, and the recognition that she was looking at something that Henry had built and maintained in secret for reasons she did not yet understand, and something he had built well enough to survive 63 years and the hands of an estate appraiser who had evaluated the chest for 90 seconds and found it worth $200. She reached into the compartment. Her fingers found a bundle, cylindrical, wrapped in what felt like waxed cloth. She lifted it out carefully. It was heavier than she expected. She unwrapped it on the floor, working the cloth back with methodical slowness, and found herself holding a leather roll, tied with a thin leather cord. She untied it and unrolled it on the floorboards. Inside were documents, multiple pages, some clearly old, their edges gone brittle and tanned with age, and some more recent, crisp paper in protective plastic sleeves. On top of them, folded in thirds, was an envelope. On the envelope, in Henry's handwriting, a handwriting she had known since she was old enough to recognize letters, were 2 words. For Nora. Her hands were perfectly steady. She had not expected them to be. She had thought if she ever found something like this, whenever she had imagined hidden compartments as a child and cataloged them as a reader and filed them as a librarian, her hands would shake. But they were steady on the envelope, and the steadiness was the strangest part, as though something in her body had already known this was coming and had decided to greet it with calm. She didn't open the envelope yet. She set it aside and looked at the document still in the leather roll. The topmost was a letter, handwritten, on paper, that felt different from ordinary paper. Heavier, creamier, the kind used for formal correspondence. The date in the upper right corner read April 14th, 1962. The salutation read Henry, and it was signed at the bottom by a name she didn't recognize, Arthur Wren. She read the first paragraph, and then she read it again. And then she sat very still on the floor of her bedroom, with the light changing in the window as the afternoon moved toward evening. Then she called into the next room. "Gracie?" "Yeah," from the couch, still movie-absorbed. "Are you hungry?" "Kind of. I'm going to make pasta in 20 minutes, okay? Come find me when you hear the water boil." "Okay, Mommy." Nora gathered the documents carefully, rewrapped them in the waxed cloth, and tucked the leather roll under her arm. She placed the envelope on top. She sat on the edge of her bed and picked up her phone. She needed to think before she opened the envelope. She needed to understand the shape of what she was looking at before she let herself feel it. It was the same thing she'd done in the estate attorney's conference room, sitting at the end of the long table while her uncle and her aunt negotiated over the specific contours of what they intended to keep. And it was the same thing she'd done in the hospital 11 days before. That with her hand on Henry's doorframe, and the paramedics moving past her, and Gracie's face pressed against her ribs. She did not fall apart at the beginning of things. She understood that falling apart came later, in produce sections and school libraries, and she was learning to make room for that instead of fighting it. But first, she needed to understand. The letter from Arthur Wren was dated 62 years ago. The content of its first paragraph referenced a private transaction that Henry had facilitated, and specifically referenced the delivery of materials to a secure location in Henry's care, and described those materials as part of a much larger arrangement they had discussed in person the previous month. She had read enough of it to understand that Arthur Wren trusted Henry with something, and that the trust had been established over a period of years, and that what was being trusted to him was not small. She needed to know who Arthur Wren was. She picked up her phone and typed his name into a search engine. The results were not nothing. They were not the blankness of someone who had never been significant. They were the results of someone who had been very significant and was very dead. Arthur Wren had been a collector. The obituary from 1979 in the Memphis Register described him as a private collector of rare stamps, numismatic materials, historical artifacts, and fine art, and noted that his collection had been considered one of the most significant privately held accumulations in the American South. It mentioned that he had been reclusive, that he had distrusted institutions and brokers and auction houses, that he had done much of his business through personal relationships and private transactions. It mentioned that he had no surviving family. No, it mentioned that the disposition of his estate had been a matter of some legal complexity, and that certain portions of his collection had never been fully accounted for. Nora read this 4 times. Then she heard the knock at her front door. She did not know the man standing on her porch. He was somewhere in his late 50s, broad through the shoulders, wearing clothes that did not quite match his face, the clothes too deliberate, the face too transactional. He had the quality of someone who had looked up her address and driven here, and was now performing a version of casualness that he had prepared in advance. "Ms. Calloway?" His voice was practiced, warm in the way of salesmen and certain politicians. "My name is Terrence Voss. I'm a collector and estate consultant. I deal primarily in American antiques, fine furniture, that type of thing." He paused, and the pause was calculated in a way that made the hair on her arms register something her mind was still processing. "I knew your grandfather. I was hoping we might talk." Nora did not open the screen door. She looked at him through it. "I knew about the chest of drawers," Terrence Voss continued, and his tone shifted just slightly, a fraction of pressure applied to the words. "The specific ones, not the general category. Henry and I had a business relationship going back some years. I believe he may have left certain items in your care, items with significant value. I'd be very interested in discussing them with you, and I want you to know that I represent buyers who would be extremely generous." He smiled. The smile did not change his eyes. "I'm not interested," Nora said. He blinked. "Just like that. I haven't even told you the numbers we're talking about." "I'm not interested," she said again, and she closed the interior door and held her hand flat against it and stood in her hallway, listening to the silence on the other side. After a moment, she heard his footsteps recede. She went to the window in the front room and watched him walk to a car parked at the curb, a black SUV with tinted rear windows that had not been there that morning. He stood beside it for a moment, looking at the house. Then he got in and drove away. Nora went back to her bedroom. Gracie appeared in the doorway, a rabbit under her arm. I heard the door. "Who was that?" "No one," Nora said. "A salesman." Gracie looked at her with the specific, penetrating attention of a 7-year-old who did not entirely believe this, but had not yet decided whether to pursue it. Then she held up Oliver. "He wants pasta, too." Nora smiled. "Of course he does. Come help me with the water." While the pasta cooked and Gracie set the table with the careful ceremony she brought to all domestic tasks, Nora thought about the man on the porch. He had known about the chest of drawers specifically. Not about Henry's estate in general, not about antiques, or the Victorian house, or the stickly chairs that had genuinely moved the appraiser to quiet emotion. He had known about this one piece of furniture, the reproduction Victorian that was worth $200, the thing everyone else had laughed at. He had known Henry. He had come here within 6 weeks of Henry's death, before Nora had even had time to properly clean the piece, and he had stood on her porch with his calculated warmth and spoken about buyers who would be extremely generous. Henry had written for Nora on an envelope and hidden it inside a secret panel in a chest of drawers that everyone else had dismissed. And a man Nora had never met had come to her door to talk about significant value and generous buyers. She stirred the pasta and watched Gracie fold napkins into imprecise triangles with great concentration. After dinner, after Gracie was in bed with Oliver, and the nightlight casting its orange glow across the ceiling, Nora went back to her bedroom and picked up the envelope. She sat on the edge of the bed, in the same position she had held Henry's hand. In 22 years ago when his wife Eleanor died, in the position she had held in hospitals and difficult rooms her whole life, upright and present and not yet committed to what came next. She opened the envelope. Henry's handwriting was on 3 pages of lined notebook paper, the kind from the pads he bought in bulk at the office supply store in town. She recognized the weight of the pen he always used, a medium ballpoint that pressed slightly harder on the downstrokes, giving everything he wrote a particular gravity. The date at the top read June 3rd of the previous year. Nora, he had written. If you are reading this, it means you found the panel, which means you cleaned the chest properly, which means you took it home, which means I was right about you, which is something I have always known, but have now confirmed in a way that makes me happy, even though I won't be here to tell you so directly. She pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. She continued. There are things I should have told you years ago. I kept putting it off, partly because I wasn't sure of the right moment, and partly because I am, as you have always known, a private man who sometimes mistakes privacy for protection. But the time for privacy has passed. What I have to tell you is important, and more than important. It is yours. I want to start with Arthur Wren. Arthur was my closest friend from 1954 until his death in 1979. We met in the Navy. He was from Mississippi, educated, strange in the way that truly brilliant people sometimes are, not cold, but somehow apart. He had grown up in a family with resources and had spent his adult life cultivating an eye for beautiful and valuable things. Not as a business, though there was money in it, as a vocation, as the thing that made his life feel particular and intentional. In the early 1950s, Arthur began acquiring seriously, rare stamps primarily, but also numismatic material, meaning coins and currency, and some fine art. And over time, historical documents and certain other materials that are itemized in the ledger you will find further in the leather roll. He was extraordinarily careful about documentation. Every piece he bought had provenance. Every transaction was recorded. He was not a man who dealt in anything that couldn't be traced to its legitimate origin, and he believed rightly that the provenance was a significant part of the value. So Arthur was not interested in the institutional routes for any of this, not auction houses, not brokers, not banks. He had reasons for this that made sense to him and which he explained to me over many years of conversation. He trusted people he knew personally. That was his system. His collection grew through those personal relationships, quietly and consistently, over 25 years. When Arthur died in 1979, he had no family. He had a lawyer, and he had me. And he left me something I did not expect. Not money, not the collection itself, but the keys to it, metaphorically and in some cases literally, and the documentation required to claim it, and a letter explaining that he had watched me for 25 years and trusted me above anyone else he knew. I want to be honest about what I did with this. I was frightened. I was 51 years old with your mother in high school, and a mortgage, and a working life that had nothing to do with stamps and rare coins and art. The collection Arthur had built was not in our house. It was in facilities he had established over the years, secure and discreet, and it was documented in the materials he left me. And the total value, even in 1979, was something I could not look at directly for more than a moment before something in me retreated from the number. I sat on it for years. I told your mother nothing. I told no one. I kept Arthur's documentation in the panel I built in the chest, and I kept the chest in my bedroom where I could see it every day. And I waited for the courage to do something with what I'd been given. The courage took longer than I would like to admit. In 1997, I finally consulted a lawyer. Not Gerald's lawyer, not anyone in Millbrook, but a woman in Nashville named Clara Holt, who specialized in estate and trust law and who had been recommended by a professor at Vanderbilt I'd written to asking an anonymous question about inherited collections and legal obligations. Clara Holt spent 3 months reviewing everything Arthur had left me. She determined that his bequest to me was legally sound, that the collection was clean, that the provenance he had maintained was sufficient to establish legitimate ownership. She helped me establish a trust. The trust is called the Wren Calloway Preservation Trust. It holds Arthur's collection, which I have maintained, and in some cases added to over the 44 years since he died. It also holds certain property interests Arthur acquired before his death, which have appreciated in ways that even Clara found surprising when she reviewed the most recent appraisals. The total value of the trust assets as of the last full appraisal, conducted 14 months ago, was $324 million. Nora stopped reading. She looked at the number on the page. She read it again. She put the letter down on the bed beside her and placed both hands flat on her knees and sat very still in the orange-lit dark of her bedroom and let the number exist in the room with her for a moment. $324 million. She picked the letter up again. "I know this is an enormous number," Henry had written. It was an enormous number to me, too, even after 44 years of proximity to it. I want to be careful about how I explain what comes next, because I know how it will sound, and I know you will need time to understand it, and I am asking you to take that time. You are the sole beneficiary of the Wren Calloway Preservation Trust. I made this decision 11 years ago, and I have reviewed it every year since then, and have never had cause to change it. This was not a decision I made lightly or thoughtlessly. It was the most deliberate decision of my adult life. You are the only person in this family who ever understood that some things matter more than money. You are the only one who came to see me when there was nothing to gain. You brought my great-granddaughter to sit with me and told her stories about me and made sure she would remember me. You read to me. You sat with me when I was afraid and didn't make me say I was afraid. And you are the person Eleanor would have chosen if she had been here to choose. Gerald and Patricia are my children, and I love them, but they are not you, and they would not do with this what it needs to be done. The collection Arthur built over his lifetime, the things he preserved because he believed they were worth preserving, they deserve better than what Gerald or Patricia would do with them. I believe you will know what to do. I believe this the way I have believed very few things in my life with complete confidence. The legal documentation is in the leather roll. Clara Holt is still practicing in Nashville. Her card is in the envelope. Call her before you tell anyone else. There are people who will come to you when word gets out, and some of them before word gets out, because some of them have been watching this situation for longer than you know. You need legal counsel before you speak with any of them, and do not let anyone pressure you. The trust is yours. The documentation is thorough. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either mistaken or lying. I kept this from you for many years, and I'm sorry for that. There is no fully satisfying explanation for why a private man stays private past the point when privacy is no longer serving anything. I am sorry you have to learn this in a letter instead of a conversation. I would have preferred to be in the room with you when you found it. I would have liked to see your face. Take good care of Gracie. Take good care of yourself. I was right about you, Nora. I have always been right about you. With all my love, Henry. Nora sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. Outside her window, the night was the particular quiet of a neighborhood after 10 o'clock. The sound of crickets and a distant television and the occasional car moving through the dark. Gracie was asleep in the next room with Oliver under her chin. In her hand, Nora held 3 pages of notebook paper that had changed the coordinates of her life in the time it took to read them. She thought about Terence Voss on her porch with his practiced warmth and his buyers who would be extremely generous. She thought about Gerald's voice at the conference room table when he'd said the chest was hers to take, that expansive generosity of a man who had gotten everything he came for. She thought about Patricia looking at the chest with that careful blankness that had contained something she'd chosen not to read clearly at the time, which she read clearly now. Patricia had known something. Not everything, perhaps, but something. She thought about Henry opening the bottom drawer with both hands, offering Gracie the red tin of peppermint candies, watching his great-granddaughter select one with enormous seriousness. She reached for her phone and found Clara Holt's card in the envelope. She looked at the number for a moment. It was almost 11 o'clock. She would call in the morning. She would call in the morning, and she would take this one step at a time, and she would not do what she could feel pulling at her, which was to collapse entirely from the weight of the last 11 days, and this letter, and this number, and the enormity of a gift she hadn't known was coming. She put the card on her nightstand. She folded Henry's letter with care and put it back in the envelope. She rewrapped the leather roll in the waxed cloth and put it in the back of her own closet, behind the winter coats, in a box she pulled out and repacked around it. Then she went and stood in Gracie's doorway for a moment, listening to her daughter breathe. She thought, he was right about me. She thought, I have to be. She did not sleep for a long time, but when she did, it was deeply and without dreams. The sleep of someone who has received something enormous and has decided to be equal to it. The chest of drawers stood against the wall in her bedroom, dark and water-stained, and worth $200 in any room that hadn't seen the letter inside the panel that had seen the letter that changed everything. The third drawer was closed. The electrical tape placeholder was still there, patient and practical, a fold of black tape over a screw hole in the old wood. Not broken, Henry's voice said somewhere in her memory. Just needs a placeholder until I find the right hardware. She had found it. She was going to have to figure out what it meant. Clara Holt's office was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Nashville that had been built in the 70s and renovated twice since, each renovation adding something and subtracting something else, so that the result was a building that felt slightly composite, like a sentence revised too many times. The waiting room had leather chairs and a view of the Cumberland River through floor-to-ceiling windows, and a receptionist who brought Nora coffee without being asked, which was either standard practice or a sign that she looked like someone who needed it. She had called Clara Holt at 8:15 that morning. The woman who answered had been neither surprised nor warm, exactly, but something in between those things, a professional steadiness that Nora found immediately reassuring. So Clara had said she remembered Henry well and was deeply sorry for her loss, and could she come in at 2 o'clock? It was now 1:58. Gracie was at school. Nora had spent the morning with the leather roll spread across her kitchen table, reading everything in it, twice, writing notes on a legal pad in the careful librarian's hand she'd developed over 12 years of making information usable. She had made a list of questions. She had made a second list of things she didn't understand well enough to form questions about yet. She had put everything back in the roll and driven to Nashville with the roll in a canvas bag on the passenger seat and her hands steady on the wheel. Clara Holt was 71 and looked 60, with cropped silver hair and glasses on a chain, and the bearing of someone who had spent a career being the most prepared person in any room. She shook Nora's hand with both of hers and looked at her for a moment, in a way that felt assessing but not unkind. "You have his eyes," Clara said. Nora had been told this before. She sat down. Clara took the leather roll from her with the care of someone handling something that had been in her mind for a long time. She untied it and spread the contents on the desk, and Nora watched her move through the documents with the particular economy of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for and where to find it. She paused on certain pages and turned others over and looked at a few things through a small magnifying glass she produced from her desk drawer. After 12 minutes of near silence, Clara set the magnifying glass down and looked up. "Everything's in order," she said, which is what I would have expected knowing Henry. He was meticulous. Can you explain to me what all of it means? Nora had her legal pad open on her knee. Clara folded her hands. I'll start at the beginning, because some of this history matters. Arthur Wren began collecting in 1951. By the time he died in 1979, he had assembled something genuinely extraordinary. Most of the serious American philatelic collection, meaning stamps, from that era, went through the established auction houses. Arthur didn't work that way. He bought privately, through relationships, from families liquidating estates, from other collectors who trusted him because he was known to be fair and known to be discreet. The result was a collection whose provenance is, in many ways, better documented than things that went through formal channels, because every transaction had a personal relationship behind it, and Arthur recorded all of them. She tapped one of the documents. The philatelic holdings alone would attract significant attention in the current market. There are 12 items in the collection considered museum-quality rarities. 3 of them are believed by the philatelic community to be lost. The last public record of their existence was in the 1960s. Nora wrote this down. Beyond stamps, Arthur collected numismatic materials, coins primarily, pre-Civil War American currency, some colonial-era pieces, and a significant holding in gold coinage from the 1800s. He had an eye for paper money as well, some Confederacy-era notes that are exceedingly rare in the condition he maintained. Clara paused. He also acquired 4 paintings over the course of his life, each of which he bought privately. One of them I don't think Arthur ever fully understood the value of. What is it? A landscape. American, early 19th century. Arthur bought it in 1963 from the estate of a Mississippi family who'd had it so long they'd stopped seeing it. He paid $1,100. The current appraisal on that painting is $37 million. The number sat in the room. Nora wrote it down. There are also property interests, Clara continued. Arthur bought several parcels of land in the 1960s and 70s, primarily in Tennessee and Mississippi, that he considered long-term holdings. Henry maintained those holdings faithfully. Several of them are now worth multiples of their original purchase price, due to development surrounding them. One particular parcel in Williamson County became highly desirable when the county expanded south, and it's now the subject of significant developer interest. Nora thought about Terence Voss on her porch, his buyers who would be extremely generous. Someone came to my door 2 days after I found the panel, she said. A man named Terence Voss. He said he was a collector and estate consultant, and that he'd had a business relationship with Henry. Clara's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted. I know who Terence Voss is. He is not a collector. He is a broker who works with a development consortium based in Atlanta. They have been watching that Williamson County parcel for at least 5 years. Henry rejected 3 separate inquiries from them in the last decade. She looked at Nora steadily. They've been aware that Henry was elderly, and that his estate would eventually become available. I suspect they knew about the trust in general terms, though I don't know how. The specific details, the scope of the collection, the legal structure, those are confidential. But the land parcel is a matter of public record. How would they know to come to me specifically? Nora asked. And how would they know about the chest? Clara was quiet for a moment. That's a more troubling question. The trust is structured so that the beneficiary is identified by name, but the relationship to Henry is not specified in the public filing. To know that you were the beneficiary and that you had taken the chest, someone would need access to information that shouldn't be publicly available. Meaning, someone talked. Clara's hands were still flat on the desk. Henry told me, when we set up the trust 11 years ago, that he had not told his children about it. He was very clear on that point. He said he had reasons that he didn't elaborate on. Clara looked at her carefully. I believed him. But But people notice things. Attorneys notice things. Document searches, estate filings. Henry's probate opened the day after he died. Nora blinked. That fast? Gerald filed it himself within hours. Clara's voice remained even. That's legal. He's the next of kin, and he had the paperwork ready. The question of why he had it ready within hours of his father's death is a different conversation. Nora thought about Gerald at the conference room table, his ease, his preparation, the practiced nature of the argument he and Patricia had clearly rehearsed before arriving. She thought about Robert, Patricia's husband, checking his phone during the inventory with the urgency of someone waiting for a signal. They were looking for it, she said. They were looking for something, Clara said. Whether they know specifically about the Wren Calloway Trust, or whether they suspect Henry had hidden assets they weren't able to locate, I can't say for certain. What I can tell you is that the trust was properly established and properly documented, and your position as sole beneficiary is legally sound. Henry was of sound mind when he established it, and every review since, the last of which I conducted myself 14 months ago. No one can contest the trust's validity on grounds of incompetence. The documentation is airtight. What can they contest it on? Nora asked. Clara looked at her with what might have been the beginning of approval. Good question. So they could argue undue influence. They would have to establish that you manipulated Henry into naming you beneficiary. Given that Henry was meticulous about his reasons and documented them extensively, that's a difficult argument to make. She paused. They could argue that Henry's estate, meaning his personal assets separate from the trust, owed debts that the trust should satisfy. They would have to manufacture those debts. Can they do that? I have seen worse attempts. Clara's voice was dry. I want you to retain me formally today, if you're willing, so that I can begin preparing the trust claim and establishing your legal position before anyone moves against you. My fees are considerable, and I want to be transparent about that. Nora thought about her bank account. She thought about the brake pads. How considerable. Clara named a number. Nora wrote it down and looked at it for a moment. I don't have that right now. I know. Clara folded her hands. Henry thought about this. There is a provision in the trust structure that allows for a distribution from the trust assets to cover legal fees incurred in the process of claiming the trust. It's modest, $50,000, but it covers the cost of initial representation through the claim process. It was Henry's way of ensuring that a cash-poor beneficiary wasn't unable to claim what he'd left. Nora put down her pen and looked at the river through the window for a moment. The light on the water was the flat silver of a November afternoon. He thought of everything, she said. It was not entirely a statement. It was also grief, moving through her in the particular way grief moved when you encountered evidence of a love you hadn't fully known the dimensions of while it was happening. He was thorough, Clara said, and her voice held something careful in it, the consideration of a woman who had known Henry for 30 years and was choosing her words. He loved you very much, Nora. I don't say that as a professional observation. He talked about you often, about your daughter. He was specific in his reasons for choosing you, and they were entirely consistent across the 11 years I advised him on this matter. He never wavered. Nora pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose. Then she picked up her pen. Tell me what we need to do first. The process of formally claiming a trust was, Clara explained, not simple, but also not mysterious. It required establishing Nora's identity as the named beneficiary, which the documentation supported clearly. It required notifying the trustee institutions, 2 banks in Nashville and 1 in Memphis, where the financial assets were held, and a secure storage facility in Franklin, where the collection itself was maintained. It required filing certain documents with the state, which Clara would handle. and it required, in all likelihood, preparing for legal challenges from Gerald and Patricia once they became aware of the trust's existence, which they would as soon as the estate filing revealed that certain assets were not part of Henry's probate estate. "Which will happen soon," Clara said. "Gerald's attorney is conducting the estate inventory. When they realize the collection isn't in the house and the property interests aren't in Henry's personal holdings, they'll start looking. They may already be looking." "How long do I have?" "Weeks. Maybe less." Clara looked at her directly. "I want to move quickly. I need you to be reachable, and I need you to be careful about what you say to family members before we have the formal claim established." Nora thought about Gerald calling that afternoon, which he had. She had let it go to voicemail. His message had been brief and friendly in the hollow way of friendliness that had something behind it. "Just checking in. Hope you're doing okay. Give me a call when you get a chance." She had not called back. "I can be careful," Nora said. "There's one more thing I need to tell you about," Clara said. She reached into a drawer and produced a folder. Separate from the collection and the property interests, Henry maintained a small personal fund for what he called immediate needs. His phrase, "It's a simple savings account in both your names. He added you as a joint account holder 4 years ago. It doesn't go through the trust. It's already yours, legally, right now." Nora looked at the folder. "How much?" $84,000. The room was very quiet. Nora could hear the faint sound of the building's ventilation and the distant noise of traffic 14 floors below. "He put it in both our names," she said. "He did it 4 years ago." 4 years ago, she had been 2 years out of her divorce, working part-time at the library and part-time at the coffee shop downtown, living in the rental house that took most of what she made, and saving almost nothing. 4 years ago, Gracie had been 3, and Nora had been going through the particular daily mathematics of poverty that required constant recalculation and produced a kind of permanent low-grade exhaustion she had started to think of as just how life felt. She had not known the account existed. She had called Henry every Sunday at noon, and he had told her she was doing fine, and he had been quietly making sure she could be. "He was watching out for me," she said. "Yes," Clara said simply. Nora drove home in the early dark with the heat on and the radio off. She was not thinking about $324 million, or not thinking about it in any way she could do anything useful with. She was thinking about Henry's phone calls, about the particular quality of his voice when he told her she was doing fine, the way it always sounded certain rather than reassuring, as though he was conveying information rather than offering comfort. She was thinking about how a person could love you in ways that only became fully visible after they were gone. She thought about Gracie at 7 years old, selecting peppermint candies with enormous seriousness. She thought about what it meant that Henry had watched his great-granddaughter do this and had understood, from that particular evidence, that Nora was the one. She stopped at the grocery store on the way home and bought chicken and vegetables for soup and a small bar of good chocolate that she allowed herself approximately every 2 weeks, and she stood in the checkout line and felt the altered quality of the world she was standing in, the same world and entirely different, and tried to understand what it meant to go from one kind of life to another kind of life in the space of reading a letter. Gerald called again that night. She let it go to voicemail. She listened to the message twice. Still brief, still friendly, still with that undercurrent of something that wasn't quite urgency but was adjacent to it. "When you get a moment, no rush." His voice was the voice of a man who was telling himself there was no rush while believing there was. Patricia sent a text. "Just wanted to check how you're settling in with the chest." Also wanted to say, "Again, I'm sorry things felt difficult at the meeting. But we're family, and I want us to be okay. Let me know if you want to talk." The text had the quality of something drafted and revised. Nora read it twice and didn't respond. She made the soup and sat with Gracie at the kitchen table and listened to her daughter's detailed report on the day, which included a conflict over a crayon and a successful library project about penguins, and Oliver having a dream that morning, which Gracie had apparently been informed about through channels she declined to specify. "Mommy, can we have Christmas with Great-Grandpa Henry's things this year?" Gracie was eating her soup with the specific absorption of a child who has decided something while eating is the right time to bring it up, like his pictures and his stuff. So he's still kind of there? Nora looked at her daughter. "Of course. And can we get a real tree this year? Not the little one." Nora thought about the account in both their names. She thought about Clara's retainer and the careful movement forward and the need to be measured. "Yes," she said, "we can get a real tree." Gracie went back to her soup with satisfaction. The first call from Gerald's attorney arrived 3 days later. A woman named Beverly Marsh, who spoke with the particular layered politeness of someone trained to deliver unpleasant things in pleasant packaging. She was calling on behalf of Gerald and Patricia Calloway in the matter of Henry Calloway's estate, and it had come to their attention that certain assets had not appeared in the estate inventory, specifically a trust instrument and associated collection that appeared to have been established at some point during Henry's lifetime. Fawn and the family was naturally concerned and hoped this could be resolved simply and amicably. Nora listened to all of this. When Beverly Marsh paused, Nora said, "My attorney is Clara Holt in Nashville. Please direct all communication through her." There was a pause. "Of course," Beverly Marsh said. "We'll be in touch." That afternoon, Clara called. Beverly Marsh had been in touch already. Gerald's position, what conveyed through Marsh with the efficiency of someone who had prepared their opening argument in advance, was that Henry had established the trust during a period of diminished capacity and under the undue influence of Nora, who had been his primary caretaker in his final years, and had used that access to manipulate him for personal financial gain. Nora was sitting in the library break room during her lunch hour. The coffee maker was cycling. Outside the break room door, she could hear a class of third graders being led through the stacks by her colleague Donna. "He wasn't diminished," she said. "He was 91, and he called me every Sunday, and he was sharper than most people I know who are half his age. I know that, and you know that." Clara's voice was steady. "The claim is not expected to succeed on its merits. It's expected to create pressure. If they can make this expensive and slow and uncertain enough, they're calculating that you'll settle rather than litigate. They know your financial situation, or they think they do. What should I do?" "Keep moving forward. I've already filed the formal claim on the trust. The trustee institutions have been notified. The claim is in process. What Gerald and Patricia are doing is responsive. They're reacting to something that's already in motion. They don't get to freeze the process just by asserting a challenge, but they can slow it. They can try." Clara paused. "There's something else." Beverly Marsh mentioned the Williamson County parcel specifically, not the collection, the land. She said Gerald has a buyer interested in the parcel and wants to discuss a cooperative approach to the asset resolution. Nora set down her coffee. Terrence Voss. Almost certainly. So Gerald and Voss are connected. They may have been in contact. Or Gerald learned about Voss and reached out to him. Or the consortium Voss represents reached out to Gerald when they saw the probate filing. The mechanics matter less than the fact. They're coordinating. Nora looked at the break room wall. There was a calendar from 3 years ago that no one had taken down, and a coffee mug that said, "World's okayest librarian," that Donna had given her as a joke. "What does the Williamson County land look like right now?" she asked. "If someone wanted to develop it." It's 40 acres, wooded mostly, but flat terrain near a major road, surrounded on 3 sides now by residential development that went up in the last decade. Clara was quiet for a moment. Nora, the parcel is currently appraised at $22 million. If approved for mixed development, which a buyer could likely get through zoning given the surrounding development pattern, that number goes to somewhere between 60 and 80 million. Their interest is not in the fair market value, it's in the development value. So they're not trying to buy it at 22 million. They would offer somewhat above that, enough to look like a serious offer, enough to make you feel like saying yes is the practical choice. And saying no? Saying no requires you to hold it and manage it and deal with the legal challenge and the pressure and the uncertainty. Clara's voice was not unkind. I want you to understand what you're choosing to hold, Nora. I also want you to understand that the collection is real and the trust is real and the legal foundation is solid. What you're choosing to hold is worth holding. The third graders passed the break room door in a loose line, one of them pausing to press his face briefly against the break room window before being retrieved by Donna with the patient firmness of long practice. Nora watched the kid's face appear and disappear. Tell me about the painting, she said. The landscape. Well, the $37 million one, Clara told her. American Hudson River School, mid-19th century. A painter named Elias Cromwell, who had died young and whose small body of work had been largely lost or unattributed. Arthur Wren had bought it in 1963, not knowing who painted it, attracted by the quality of the light and the sense of specific place that good landscape painting had, and that bad landscape painting didn't. He'd lived with it for 16 years and grown increasingly interested in its provenance before he died. Henry had continued the research, quietly, over 4 decades, and had finally had it properly attributed in 2019 by an art historian at Vanderbilt, who had nearly fallen out of her chair when she saw the signature on the back of the canvas. It's currently in climate-controlled storage in Franklin, Clara said, along with the rest of the collection. Henry visited it once a year for 40 years. Nora thought about Henry driving to Franklin by himself once a year to look at a painting in a storage facility, not telling anyone. Keeping the watch over a dead man's collection for 40 years because Arthur Wren had trusted him with it, and Henry understood what trust required. She thought about the 2 rocking chairs in the inspiration story she'd read once, the ones positioned at a deliberate angle, waiting. She thought about loyalty that outlasted death. I want to go see it, she said. The collection. Can I do that? You're the beneficiary of the trust that owns it. You can absolutely do that. She went the following Saturday, leaving Gracie with Mrs. Henderson with the explanation of an errand in Nashville, a simplification rather than a lie. Clara had arranged access through the storage facility and met her there in person. The facility was in an industrial park east of Franklin, its exterior deliberately nondescript, a building you would drive past without a second look. Now inside, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the air had a quality of careful maintenance. Clara exchanged pleasantries with the facility manager, a man named Davis, who wore a tie and checked his clipboard, with the manner of someone who took stewardship seriously, and led Nora through a corridor and a keypad-locked door and another corridor to a room at the end of the building. Davis unlocked the room. Clara stepped back slightly, an instinctive courtesy, and Nora walked in. Now, the room was climate-controlled and lit by warm, even overhead light that cast no harsh shadows. The walls were lined with purpose-built shelving and a series of flat storage drawers with archival handles. On a central table sat a series of display boxes, each containing a collection of stamps in protective mounts, their colors preserved in the controlled atmosphere with a vividness that seemed almost improbable. On a separate stand, mounted carefully and lit from above with museum-quality track lighting, hung a canvas approximately 3 feet by 4 feet. A landscape, a river valley in autumn or early morning, the light catching water and hillside with the specific quality of someone who had looked at that particular light in that particular place and understood it well enough to make you feel you were standing in it. Nora stood in front of the painting for a long time. She was not an art expert. She was a librarian with 34 years of reading, and the particular kind of informed curiosity that librarians developed, broad and connected, and good at finding what she didn't know. But she didn't need expertise to understand that she was standing in front of something that had been carefully watched over for 60 years, that had passed from Arthur Wren's eye for quality to Henry's quiet guardianship, that had spent decades in a storage room in Franklin, while the world above it went on without any idea it existed. He bought it because he loved it, Nora said. Arthur. He didn't know what it was worth. Clara was standing behind her. That's correct. And he kept it because it was beautiful, not because of the value. Yes. Nora thought about the water-stained chest of drawers in her bedroom, about Douglas, the appraiser, examining it for 90 seconds and finding it worth $200. Oh, about the entire apparatus of people who decided what things were worth and communicated that worth to rooms full of people who listened. She thought about what it meant to love something for reasons that had nothing to do with what other people thought it was worth. She thought about Henry. Clara gave her an hour in the room before she came to stand beside her. There were other items she should see. The stamp collection in its archival drawers, the numismatic cases, the documentation files that provided the provenance chain for everything. They worked through the room methodically, Clara explaining and Nora absorbing, asking questions and writing things on her legal pad and trying to hold the reality of what she was looking at against the reality of her life, her brake pad truck and her rental house, and the real Christmas tree she'd promised Gracie. Before they left, Davis produced a folder. Mr. Calloway's last visit record, he said. He was here October 3rd. 6 weeks before he died. Nora took the folder and looked at the sign-in sheet. Henry's signature at the bottom, the familiar ballpoint weight of it. Duration of visit, 2 hours and 15 minutes. He came for 2 hours and 15 minutes, she said. 6 weeks before he died. Davis nodded. He came every year, always in October, always about 2 hours. Nora handed the folder back and stood for a moment in the corridor outside the room. What was he doing in there for 2 hours? Clara asked. Looking, Nora said. Just looking. On the drive back to Millbrook, she thought about what it meant to tend something for 40 years, to take responsibility for a dead man's life's work and carry it forward quietly, without recognition, without telling anyone, driven only by the understanding that it mattered and that someone had to ensure it continued to matter. She thought about Henry watching over Arthur Wren's collection the way others watched over other things, children, promises, the memory of people they had loved. She called him every Sunday at noon, she thought, and he had been holding this all that time, this enormous thing, and had never mentioned it because it wasn't the right moment, or because privacy was a difficult habit to break, or because the right words for telling someone they were going to inherit $324 million were genuinely hard to find. And so he had just been Henry on the phone, telling her she was doing fine, meaning it. Gerald called again that night. This time she picked up. He was warm. He asked about Gracie. He asked about the chest of drawers. Had she found it comfortable? Was it fitting all right in her space? The questions had a texture that wasn't quite casual. Gerald, Honor, she said. I know about the trust. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she could hear him breathing. He recovered quickly. He was good at recovering quickly. The trust. He made it sound like a word he was testing the weight of. Henry mentioned something years ago, but I never got details. Clara Holt is my attorney. Please have Beverly Marsh contact her. Another silence. Then his voice shifted, shedding the warmth like a coat dropped in a hallway. Nora, I want you to think carefully about what you're doing. We're family. Whatever Dad set up, we can work this out between us. You don't need lawyers. I do need lawyers, she said. And she found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't feel apologetic about it. The apologetic feeling had been there in the conference room, sitting at the end of the long table in her interview blazer, and it had been there for most of her adult life in various rooms, where she had been the least resourced person, for the most precarious, the one with the most to lose. It wasn't there now. Gerald's voice cooled further. You know Patricia and I can challenge this. We have grounds. Henry was 91. He was 91 and completely competent, and he documented everything, Nora said. Clara Holt was his attorney for 30 years. She conducted a competency review 14 months ago. You can file what you want, but you should know what you're filing against. She could hear him recalibrating, and then his voice, when it came back, had the quality of someone who had put away one approach and was reaching for another. Look, forget the legal posturing. We have a buyer for the Williamson County property. Serious buyer, consortium backed. They're prepared to make a significant offer. We split it 4 ways, you and me and Patricia and the consortium, and everyone walks away in a better position than they're in now. You mean 3 ways, she said. Me, you, and Patricia. Well, the consortium gets the property. That's what they're buying. The consortium pays us. We split what they pay. Right. That's what I said. No, she said. You said 4 ways. He was quiet. Terrence Voss came to my door 3 days after I found the panel, she said. 3 days. Who told him? Gerald said nothing. You knew about the chest, she said. Not everything, maybe, but something. And you knew it was more than a reproduction Victorian worth $200, and you let me take it, because you thought you could deal with me more easily than you could deal with Clara Holt. Nora, have Beverly Marsh call Clara. She hung up. She stood in her kitchen for a moment with the phone in her hand and looked at the grocery store refrigerator magnets and the drawing Gracie had made of their family that included Oliver as a full member and Henry with angel wings, because Gracie had decided angels looked like regular people with wings and that Henry was definitely one now. She felt the anger that had been building since the conference room, since Douglas appraising the chest in 90 seconds and moving on, since the ease with which everyone in that room had assumed she had nothing and would take nothing and would be grateful for whatever small consideration she was shown. The anger was not the hot, immediate kind. It was the cooler, more durable kind, the kind that came from watching something you loved be misunderstood and dismissed for long enough that you'd had time to get tired of it. She had come to the estate meeting and sat at the end of the table and taken the worthless furniture and said thank you. She had found the panel and read the letter and called the lawyer and gone to see the collection, and she had not told a single person except the attorney Henry himself had chosen for her. She had been careful, and she had been steady, and she was going to continue being both of those things. She made herself chamomile tea and sat at the kitchen table and called Clara and reported the conversation. Clara was quiet through most of it. When Nora finished, there was a pause. You handled that well, Clara said. Then, Gerald mentioned the 4-way split. Yes, that's going to matter. I want that documented. Can you write down everything you remember from the conversation as precisely as possible, time and date, and email it to me tonight? Nora pulled the legal pad across the table. Or already doing it. She wrote for 20 minutes, recreating the conversation in as much detail as she could hold. The warmth, and then the cooling, and then the 4 ways that had slipped out before Gerald recalibrated. She sent it to Clara at 9:15. Clara responded at 9:17. Good. Go to sleep. We have a lot of work ahead, and you need to be rested. Nora looked at the email for a moment. She thought about the kind of person who sent emails at 9:17 at night and told their clients to go to sleep. She thought about Henry choosing Clara Holt in 1997 and maintaining that relationship for 30 years. He thought of everything, she said again, quietly, to no one. She checked on Gracie, who was asleep with Oliver on her face, in the way she sometimes slept, having apparently rolled over onto him and found his presence on her cheek acceptable. Nora repositioned the rabbit and tucked the blanket and stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to her bedroom and stood in front of the chest of drawers. The third drawer was closed. The electrical tape placeholder on the screw hole was still there. She put her hand on the drawer front and felt the wood, cool and dark-grained, and thought about Henry's hands on this same surface every day for decades, every morning taking out his reading glasses. So every visit with Gracie, opening it with ceremony to produce the red tin. She thought about what it meant to hold a secret for 40 years out of loyalty to a dead friend. She thought about Arthur Wren buying a painting in Mississippi in 1963 because the light was right, and not knowing he was buying something that would be preserved and carried forward and eventually reveal itself to a woman he'd never met, in a bedroom in Millbrook, Tennessee, on a November night 60 years later. She thought about things outlasting people, about the work of careful tending, about what it meant to be chosen. The panel in the third drawer was closed, the spring latch secure. She didn't open it. There was nothing left inside it now. The documents were with Clara. The letter was in her nightstand. The candy tin was in the drawer below with its 3 remaining peppermints. But she pressed her hand against the panel anyway, palm flat against the wood, and stood there for a moment in the dark, quiet bedroom. She thought, I understand it now. What you were doing in that storage room for 2 hours every October, just looking, making sure it was still there, making sure someone was still watching. I'm watching, she said. She felt slightly self-conscious saying it, and said it anyway. Then she went to bed. The call that changed the shape of the fight came on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks later, from a number she didn't recognize, odd with a Tennessee area code. Hello? A woman's voice, older, with the particular cadence of rural Tennessee. Is this Nora Calloway? It is. Who's calling? My name is Ruth Wren. I'm Arthur Wren's niece. There was a pause. I know he didn't have children. What most people don't know is that he had a sister, my mother, June, who he had a falling out with in the 1940s. They never reconciled. My mother is gone now, 10 years past, but I've been looking into family history, and I found references to a collection. She paused again. I don't have any legal claim to anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not calling for money. Nora sat down at her kitchen table. What are you calling for? I'm calling because I have letters, Ruth said, between Arthur and my mother, from the 1950s and 60s, before they stopped writing entirely. He talked about the collection, about what he intended for it, about his friend, Henry. She paused. I thought whoever ended up with his things should have the letters, so they know who he was, not just what he left, who he was. Nora pressed her phone against her ear and felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have words for. Ruth, she said, would you be willing to meet with me? I was hoping you'd ask that, Ruth said. They met at a diner in Columbia the following Saturday. Ruth was 78, small and sharp-eyed, with the hands of someone who had done outdoor work, and the manner of someone who had been alone long enough that conversation required a slight warm-up period, and then came easily. She brought a box. Inside the box were letters, perhaps 40 of them, rubber-banded in bundles by year, written in Arthur Wren's distinctive hand on paper that had aged to a warm cream. "I read them all," Ruth said. "Many times." She looked at Nora carefully. He was a lonely man, my uncle. Brilliant and lonely. Thought he had one real friendship in his life. She paused. "He talks about Henry in the letters from the 1960s on, with a lot of affection." Nora opened one of the letters carefully, handling it by the edges. "He writes in one of those letters," Ruth said, in 1972, "that Henry Calloway was the most honest man he knew and the only person he trusted to understand why the collection mattered." She looked down at her coffee cup. "He says, most people think a collection is about ownership. Henry understands it's about responsibility." Nora looked at the words on the page she was holding. Arthur Wren's handwriting from 1972, 52 years ago. A man she had never met describing her grandfather with an accuracy that felt almost like it was meant for her. "Responsibility," she said. "He was right about him," Ruth said. "And from what you've told me, he was right to choose him." Nora looked at the box of letters. "Can I ask you something?" Ruth nodded. "When Gerald and Patricia's attorneys come for this, and they will, would you be willing to talk to my attorney?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "Honey, I drove here in a 20-year-old Buick because I wanted the right person to have those letters. I'll talk to whoever needs to hear what I have to say." Nora looked down at the letter in her hands and thought about the chain of custody this story represented. Arthur Wren buying a painting because the light was right. Henry carrying a dead man's trust for 40 years. Henry writing a letter and hiding it in a panel he built himself and waiting for Nora to clean the furniture properly. Ruth Wren keeping letters in a box for decades and knowing, when she read about the estate proceedings online, that she needed to find whoever had become the keeper of her uncle's things. It was an old chain. It had started before she was born. And it had reached her, or through a reproduction Victorian chest of drawers worth $200 on a Sunday afternoon in November, with the light changing in the window and Gracie in the next room. She thought about Terence Voss on her porch, with his buyers and his generous offers, and the calculation behind his eyes when she'd said no. She thought about Gerald at the conference room table, the ease of him, and the specific satisfaction in his face when Douglas had appraised the chest at $200. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the bundle. She thought, they were looking for something large and obvious. They were looking for a safe or a second deed or a bank account with his name on it. They were looking in the right house for the wrong kind of hiding. Henry had hidden it in plain sight. In the bedroom, in the piece of furniture everyone dismissed, in the drawer where he kept peppermint candies and offered them to a 7-year-old with both hands. And he had hidden it where only someone who loved him and took him seriously and cleaned his furniture with care would ever find it. She thought. He knew exactly what he was doing. And she thought, looking at Ruth Wren across the diner table with the box of letters between them and the winter light coming through the window. He was right about me. She was going to have to prove it now, in rooms and courts and conversations that would test exactly what she was made of. But she had Clara Holt, and she had Arthur Wren's letters in a box, and she had the collection in its climate-controlled room in Franklin, the painting with its autumn light preserved perfectly. And she had the chest of drawers in her bedroom, water-stained and worth $200 and worth everything. She was not going to let any of it go. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in January, in a courtroom in Davidson County, where the fluorescent lights had the particular quality of light that existed outside of time, neither morning nor afternoon, neither winter nor any other season, just the flat administrative brightness of a room where people came to have disputes resolved. Nora wore the navy blazer again. She had considered buying something new and decided against it, not because she couldn't afford to, The joint account had covered Clara's retainer and her brake pads, and the real Christmas tree, and still had more than $70,000 in it. But because something in her wanted to walk into that room as exactly herself, the person who had driven 90 minutes in a truck with bad brakes and taken the chest of drawers home because it smelled like Henry. She wanted to be that person in that room. She had earned that room as that person. Clara sat beside her at the plaintiff's table. Clara had worn gray, which she apparently wore to every court proceeding because she considered it a neutral that communicated neither aggression nor submission, which was the exact posture she wanted. Her briefcase was on the table, and her notepad was open, and she had the quality of someone who had been in this room, in some version of this room, many times, and was not afraid of it. Gerald sat at the other table with Patricia and Beverly Marsh and a second attorney from Beverly's firm named Cole, who specialized in estate litigation and had the particular groomed confidence of someone whose victories had been consistent. Gerald wore a suit that was better than anything he'd owned the last time Nora saw him, which was either incidental or wasn't. Patricia sat very straight and did not look at Nora. Her hands were folded on the table in a way that looked practiced. The judge was a woman named Honorable Deborah McAllister, somewhere in her late 50s, with reading glasses she took on and off throughout proceedings, and an expression of concentrated patience that Nora found immediately reassuring. Beverly Marsh presented the challenge first. The argument was constructed carefully, 3 main pillars that Cole had apparently helped engineer over the previous weeks. First, that Henry Calloway's cognitive capacity had declined significantly in the final years of his life, and that the trust instrument, established 11 years ago, could not be assumed to reflect current intention. Second, that Nora Calloway, as primary caregiver, had exercised undue influence over an elderly and increasingly isolated man. Third, that Gerald and Patricia, as Henry's biological children, had a legal and moral claim to assets that properly formed part of his estate. Beverly was good, so Nora had to give her that. She was the kind of advocate who understood that the most effective arguments sounded reasonable even when they weren't, who understood that the vocabulary of concern, family, and fairness could be deployed with precision to make self-interest sound like principle. Gerald's face through all of this was grave and carefully sorrowful. Patricia's was controlled. They looked like people who had been genuinely hurt by something, which was a performance that required real commitment, and they were both committed to it. When Beverly finished, Clara stood. She did not begin with the trust documents. She did not begin with Samuel's testimony from the prior proceedings in the inspiration Nora had been reading about inheritance cases all autumn, which was not her case, but had shaped how she understood what was happening to her. She began with Arthur Wren. She told the story carefully and without drama, and the way good evidence was always presented, not as a narrative designed to move people, but as a sequence of facts that moved people anyway, because the facts themselves were sufficient. Arthur Wren and Henry Calloway, 1954. The Navy. A friendship built over 25 years. A collection assembled by a man with genuine knowledge and genuine love for the things he collected. A death in 1979, and a bequest made to the one person Arthur trusted absolutely. She introduced the letters, Ruth Wren's letters, into evidence. Arthur's voice from 1972 describing Henry as the only person he trusted to understand why the collection mattered. Henry understands it's about responsibility. Judge McAllister read the letter slowly. She read a second one. She set them down and looked at Beverly Marsh with an expression that had shifted slightly. Then Clara called her first witness. Ruth Wren was 78 years old and had driven a 20-year-old Buick to Nashville and was dressed in a blazer she had borrowed from her neighbor because she didn't own one and had decided the occasion required it. She sat in the witness chair with her hands in her lap and answered Clara's questions with the directness of someone who had decided the truth was the only thing worth bringing to this room. She described the letters. She described her uncle as she understood him from them. A private man. A man who took his commitment seriously. A man who had found in Henry Calloway something rare, which was a person who understood that the value of a beautiful thing had nothing to do with what other people were willing to pay for it. Beverly Marsh's cross-examination attempted to establish that Ruth had a financial interest in the outcome, that she might be testifying in exchange for some arrangement with Nora. Ruth looked at Beverly with an expression of mild confusion that shaded into gentle contempt. "I drove here from Columbia, in my own car," she said. "No one paid my expenses. No one offered me anything." She paused. "My uncle spent his whole life preserving things he loved because he believed some things deserved to exist. I came here because I thought the judge should know what kind of man he was. That's all." Beverly said nothing further. Clara's second witness was the Vanderbilt art historian, who had attributed the Cromwell painting in 2019. Dr. Alicia Ferrante was 44, precise, and brought a presentation that she had clearly used before and was clearly very good at. She explained what made the Cromwell attribution significant, the rarity of his surviving work, the quality of the light in this particular canvas, and the specific evidence of authorship in the brushwork on the lower left quadrant that she could identify definitively once she knew what she was looking at. She had the gift of making expertise accessible without condescending to the people she was making it accessible to. When Dr. Ferrante described the moment she had turned the canvas over and seen the signature, something happened to the quality of attention in the room. Even Beverly Marsh stopped writing for a moment. After so many years of being unknown, Dr. Ferrante said, of sitting in a storage room in Franklin without anyone understanding what they were looking at, it was one of the most extraordinary moments of my career. Clara let that sit for a moment. Then she introduced the most recent appraisal documentation. Every item in the trust, cataloged and valued, provenance chain intact. The total rendered in black ink on white paper. $324 million. And she looked at Judge McAllister. This collection was built by a man who loved beautiful things and trusted his friend to watch over them. Henry Calloway watched over them faithfully for 44 years. He maintained the storage agreements. He paid the climate control costs from his own pocket for decades. He commissioned the appraisals. He made sure the documentation stayed current and legally sound. He did this alone, without telling his children, not because he was secretive by nature, but because he had specific and documented reasons to believe his children would not steward this collection responsibly. She put Henry's letters on the table, the ones from the panel, the copies Clara had made, and entered into the record. She read the passage aloud. "Your father is weak when it comes to money." That was not Henry's voice, but its echo. The logic Henry had applied to Robert in the other family's story. And it was Arthur's voice, too. The same assessment rendered in 1979 about Henry's own children before they'd had time to confirm it. And Gerald and Patricia had spent the intervening years confirming it. Clara had, over the previous weeks, produced a financial history that Beverly Marsh had objected to introducing, and Judge McAllister had allowed. Gerald's commercial real estate business had filed for bankruptcy protection in 2009 and restructured with substantial creditor forgiveness. He had received a loan from Henry in 2011 of $140,000 that had never been repaid. In 2019, he had approached Henry about a second loan, and Henry had declined. Patricia's financial situation was more stable, but her relationship with Henry in the final decade had been episodic and largely transactional, a pattern of contact around the holidays and around moments when family financial discussions seemed likely to yield something. Henry had documented all of this, not with malice, with the quiet precision of a man who understood that documentation was the architecture of truth that without it, other people's versions of events filled the space. Beverly objected that this was irrelevant character assassination. Judge McAllister sustained the objection on the character assassination portion and then spent 4 minutes reading the financial summary in silence. Clara called one final witness. Nora had not expected to testify. She had asked Clara about it twice in the weeks before the hearing, and Clara had said, "We'll see. We'll see," which was Clara's way of not committing to a position until she understood what the hearing required. What the hearing required, Clara had determined, was Nora. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the courtroom. Gerald at the table across the room, his face arranged in its expression of grieved seriousness. Patricia not looking at her. Beverly Marsh with her pen ready. Clara standing. "Tell me about your relationship with Henry," Clara said. So Nora did. She talked about her mother dying when she was 16, and Henry becoming the consistent presence, the Sunday phone calls, the way he talked to her like an adult, from the time she was old enough to understand the difference. She talked about Gracie, about bringing Gracie to Henry's house and watching him hold her and the look on his face. She talked about reading to him, the Patrick O'Brian novels, the audiobooks they'd been working through together, one disc at a time. She talked about the peppermint candies. She described it simply: the bottom drawer of the chest, the red tin, the ceremony Henry made of it. Opening the drawer with both hands, offering the tin to Gracie, watching her select one candy with enormous seriousness and say thank you with a formality that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. She described this without embellishment because it didn't need any. She watched the judge's expression as she spoke. Clara asked her about the chest, about finding the panel, about reading the letter. Nora described it as it had happened: the Sunday afternoon cleaning, the seam in the wood, the panel giving, the leather roll, the envelope with her name on it. She described reading Henry's letter for the first time. "What did you feel?" Clara asked. Nora thought about this for a moment. She had been asking herself the same question since November. "I felt like he was in the room with me," she said, not in any supernatural way. But the letter sounded exactly like him, the way he thought, the way he explained things. He was meticulous, and he was honest, and he was careful. The letter was all of those things. She paused, and I felt like I understood something about him that I should have understood before. That all those years of watching over Arthur's collection, all those years of keeping the secret, wasn't separate from who he was to me. It was the same thing. He understood what it meant to hold something carefully because you cared about it. He did that with the collection, and he did that with me. She looked at her hands for a moment. He did that with Gracie. The room was quiet. Beverly Marsh's cross-examination was thorough and professional, and aimed at establishing that Nora had been in a position of influence and had used it. She asked about how often Nora had visited Henry in his final years, whether Nora had discussed finances with him, whether she had been present for any discussions about his estate planning. Nora answered everything directly. Yes, she had visited often. No, they hadn't discussed his finances in any detail. Henry had been private about financial matters, as he was about many things. No, she had not known about the trust until she found the panel. Beverly asked whether it was possible that Henry had been lonely and had grown overly dependent on Nora's attention in his final years. Whether an elderly man without much family contact might have been susceptible to the influence of someone who was attentive and present. Nora looked at Beverly and felt the anger that had been present since November move through her again. The cool, durable kind. Henry was 91 years old, she said. He had all his faculties. He called me every Sunday at noon, and the conversations were specific and engaged, and sometimes challenging. He read constantly and had opinions about everything he read. He had better judgment than most people I know at any age. She paused. He was not susceptible to anything except his own very deliberate thinking. He chose me because he thought I would do right by what he was leaving. I don't think he was wrong. Beverly had no further questions. Judge McAllister called a recess. For in the hallway outside the courtroom, Nora sat on a bench and drank from a bottle of water Clara had produced from somewhere and thought about nothing in particular. Clara stood nearby talking quietly on her phone. Ruth Wren, who had stayed for the proceedings, sat beside Nora and said nothing, which was the exact right thing. After a moment, Ruth said, "He would have liked watching you in there." "Arthur?" Nora asked. "Henry," Ruth said. She smiled a little. "Though I think Arthur would have too." When court resumed, Judge McAllister had the quality of someone who had made up their mind and was now delivering the result of that process. She began with the legal structure. The Wren Calloway Preservation Trust had been established in full compliance with Tennessee trust law. The documentation of Henry Calloway's legal capacity at the time of its establishment was thorough and credible, and supported by the testimony of an attorney who had advised him for 30 years and had no financial interest in the outcome. The documentation of his capacity at each subsequent review was similarly thorough. There was no legally sufficient basis for a claim of cognitive diminishment. She moved to undue influence. The standard for demonstrating undue influence required evidence of specific manipulation, of a relationship that had crossed from caregiving into exploitation. What the evidence actually showed, she said, was a grandfather who had thoughtfully and deliberately chosen a beneficiary, documented his reasons at length, and structured the bequest to survive precisely the kind of legal challenge now before the court. The decision to name Nora Calloway was not the product of influence. It was the product of 44 years of observation and a specific, articulate assessment of character that Henry had committed to paper and to his attorney in terms that admitted no ambiguity. She turned to Gerald and Patricia's claim as biological children. Intestacy law applies to assets that pass outside of any trust or designated beneficiary structure, she said. The Wren Calloway Preservation Trust does not pass under intestacy. It passes according to its own terms, which are legally valid and clearly documented. Son Henry Calloway had every right to establish this trust, to name any beneficiary he chose, and to do so outside his probate estate. She paused. The fact that his biological children are not that beneficiary reflects a choice he made carefully, and for reasons he articulated. This court will not substitute its judgment for his. She denied the challenge in full. She awarded legal costs to Nora. The sound that came from Gerald was not quite audible. Nora heard it anyway. It was the specific sound of someone who had been certain of something for long enough that the certainty had become structural and was now, suddenly, not. Patricia looked at her hands. Beverly Marsh was already writing. Cole was leaning toward Gerald. The professional machinery of managing a loss was already in motion. Clara touched Nora's arm. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Nora sat in the courtroom for a moment after things began to move and disperse, and after Gerald and Patricia and their attorneys gathered themselves and exited, after Clara began organizing papers, after Ruth Wren stood and smoothed her borrowed blazer. She sat and looked at the empty room around her and thought about the chain of things that had led to this moment. Arthur Wren buying a painting in Mississippi in 1963. Henry driving to Franklin every October for 40 years. A hidden panel in a reproduction chest of drawers. A letter that began, "If you are reading this, it means you cleaned the chest properly." She thought, he trusted me to clean the furniture. The smallness of it, the domestic specificity of it, landed on her as it had not quite landed before. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic revelation. He had trusted her to take the piece of furniture home and clean it the way you cleaned things you valued, carefully, with attention, with the understanding that the surface required care. Well, he had trusted her to press the corners and find the latch and not dismiss what she found. He had hidden it where only someone who loved him properly would look. She stood up and put on her coat and walked out into the January cold. The legal process of formally transferring the trust to Nora's control took 4 months. Clara had prepared for this and walked her through every step with the thoroughness that Nora had come to understand was simply how Clara operated, on not extra care for a particular client, but the standard she held for everything she did. There were trustee notifications and tax assessments and the careful documentation of every asset in the collection. And there were conversations with the storage facility in Franklin about long-term arrangements, and there was a meeting with an investment manager Clara recommended, a woman named Josephine, who wore practical shoes and spoke about asset management the way Clara spoke about law, and with complete authority and no performance of it. Through all of this, Nora went to work. She shelved books and helped third graders find resources for their penguin projects, and maintained the catalog, and sat at the reference desk answering questions. She didn't tell her colleagues what was happening. She had told no one except Clara, and eventually Mrs. Henderson, who had needed to know because Gracie was spending more time at the Hendersons, while Nora was in Nashville for meetings, and Mrs. Henderson was not the kind of person you kept things from if you were going to continue relying on her, and also because Nora trusted her, and trust was something she had come to understand more precisely over the previous months. Gracie knew something was happening. 7-year-olds always know something is happening. She knew it had to do with great-grandpa Henry and the chest of drawers, and that her mother was going on a lot of trips to Nashville that came back looking both tired and resolved. She had asked twice whether they were going to have to move, and both times Nora had said no, "We're not moving," and this had apparently been sufficient because Gracie had returned to her current concerns, which were the completion of a chapter book about a girl who kept a dragon in her apartment and the ongoing question of whether Oliver needed a companion rabbit. In March, on a Saturday, when the light was starting to have some warmth in it after the long, flat gray of January and February, Nora drove to the storage facility in Franklin alone. She had arranged the visit without telling Clara, not because Clara would have objected, but because this trip was not legal business. She signed in with Davis, who now recognized her, and greeted her with a nod that had the quality of someone acknowledging a person who belonged to something they were responsible for maintaining. She went to the room. The painting was exactly as she had left it on her first visit, for the autumn light on the river valley, the quality of the morning or the early season captured in pigment by a man who had looked at it carefully enough to know what made it specific. She stood in front of it for a long time. She thought about what Dr. Ferrante had said. After so many years of being unknown, of sitting in a storage room without anyone understanding what they were looking at. She thought about the chest of drawers in her bedroom, water-stained and worth $200. She thought about herself at the end of the conference room table, in the navy blazer she was wearing right now, watching Douglas move through Henry's life with the practiced economy of a man who assigned value to things in 90-second intervals. The world was full of people who assessed things quickly and moved on. It was not a moral failing, exactly. It was a function of limited time and attention and the specific training that told you what to look for and made you less likely to find what you weren't looking for. Douglas was not a bad man. He was a competent appraiser who had correctly assessed a reproduction chest at its market value based on everything visible to him. He could not have known about the panel. He had not been given a reason to look more closely. Henry had been given a reason, though Henry had sat with Arthur Wren's collection for 44 years and driven to this room every October and pressed his palm to the climate-controlled air and understood what it meant to watch over something carefully because it mattered. She thought, I'm the keeper now. The formal transfer of trust control was completed on a Wednesday in April, in Clara's office, with the papers spread across the conference table, and Davis from the storage facility present as a witness, and Josephine from the investment firm present to discuss the immediate management questions. Clara walked through each document. Nora signed each one with the pen she'd brought from home, the same kind of pen Henry had used, medium ballpoint, slightly heavier on the downstrokes. When it was done, Clara looked at her across the table. Henry would be pleased, she said. It was not a statement she would have made in a professional context, Nora had come to understand, unless she meant it precisely. Clara did not say things she didn't mean. Nora thought about the Sunday phone calls, about, "You're doing fine," spoken with the certainty of information. "He was already pleased," she said. "He told me so in the letter." The first decision Nora made with the trust assets was the one she had been thinking about since November. She called Dr. Ferrante in April, in 2 weeks after the transfer was complete, and asked her a question she had been shaping in her mind for months. "If you had the resources to put together a real exhibition of Cromwell's work," she said, "not just this painting, but research into what else might exist, what might have been misattributed, what might be sitting in attics and estate sales right now, without anyone knowing what they're looking at. Could you do that?" Dr. Ferrante was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant someone was doing rapid mental arithmetic about something they had wanted to do for a long time. "I've been thinking about this for 5 years, she said. "Tell me what it would take." They talked for an hour. By the end of the conversation, Nora had committed to funding a 2-year research project at Vanderbilt, centered on lost American Hudson River School works, with Dr. Ferrante as the lead. The exhibition would open at the Vanderbilt Fine Arts Gallery in 18 months and travel from there. She called Ruth Wren afterward. "There's going to be an exhibition," she said, "of Cromwell's work, starting with the painting Arthur found in 1963. It'll tell the story of the collection, how it was built, and who built it, and what it took to keep it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Arthur would have loved that more than the money. "That's why I'm doing it first." The second decision took longer to arrive at, and arrived not from calculation, but from Gracie. It was a Tuesday in May, warm enough for the first time to eat dinner outside, which Nora and Gracie did at the small table on the rental house porch. They were eating soup, and Gracie was telling a detailed story about a conflict in the school library that had apparently involved a disagreement over who had checked out a particular graphic novel series first, a matter she considered to have been resolved unjustly, and Nora was listening with the full attention she brought to Gracie's accounts of institutional injustice, because they were almost always more interesting than they initially sounded. Gracie finished the story and ate soup for a moment, and then said, "Mommy, are we still going to live here?" Nora looked at the porch, the peeling paint on the railing. The way the screen door had never quite hung right, since it was re-hung by the landlord's nephew 2 years ago. The rental house was a place she had lived in for 6 years, and survived in for 6 years, and which had the particular quality of somewhere you existed rather than somewhere you inhabited. She thought about Henry's house on Sycamore Street, the Victorian with the 4 bedrooms and the workshop behind it, and the front porch where Henry had sat in the evenings. The house that Gerald and Patricia had been fighting over in the conference room, while Nora sat at the end of the table and didn't fight over anything. The house had been sold. The probate estate had been distributed, and Henry's house was being transferred to the buyers, a young family from Nashville who had apparently fallen in love with the porch. She was glad about the young family. She was. But she thought about the workshop behind the house, where Henry had kept his tools and repaired things with the same methodical care he brought to everything. She thought about the chest of drawers, which he had kept in his bedroom for 63 years, and which was currently in her bedroom against the wall with the water stains and the electrical tape placeholder. She thought about Gracie pressing her face against the wood, on the day they brought it home, and saying it smells like Great-Grandpa Henry. Someday, she had told Gracie, no, when she was ready, about the trust and what it meant. She had explained it in the terms available to a 7-year-old, which were, Great-Grandpa Henry left us something very important, and we're going to take good care of it the way he did. Gracie had nodded seriously and said, like a job? And Nora had said, yes, exactly like a job. And Gracie had said, does it pay? And Nora had said, yes, it pays. Are we still going to live here? Gracie asked again, still eating soup. Nora looked at her daughter. I've been thinking about that, she said. And she had been. She had been thinking about it since the transfer and since the conversation with Josephine about the liquid assets and the careful pace of realizing them, and since a morning in April when she had driven past a property on the edge of Millbrook, 12 acres with a house that needed significant work, and had sat in her truck in front of it for 20 minutes, thinking about the workshop Henry had kept behind his house and what she wanted Gracie to grow up understanding about how space and work and home related to each other. It needed work, the property. The house was structurally sound, but dated, and the land was overgrown past the point of casual maintenance, and the barn at the far edge of the property had a roof that was going to require a serious conversation with a contractor. None of this was a problem. Working on something was not the same as being overwhelmed by it. She had called the realtor. I want to show you something, she told Gracie. This weekend. Gracie put down her spoon. Is it a surprise? It's a possibility, Nora said, which is better than a surprise. They drove out on Saturday morning, Nora and Gracie and Oliver, who had achieved the status of necessary companion for significant outings. The property was 7 miles outside Millbrook on a county road that ran along the edge of a ridge, and when you came over the top of the ridge and the property opened up on the right side of the road, it had the particular quality that good land sometimes had of looking like itself, settled and specific, not like anywhere else. The house was a farmhouse, white clapboard, a wide porch across the front. The realtor had left the door unlocked. They walked through the empty rooms, which smelled of age and sawdust and the particular dryness of a house that had been well built and was waiting. Gracie was quiet in the way she got quiet when she was paying close attention, moving through each room with Oliver under her arm, looking at things. She pressed her hand against the plaster walls. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the ridge. She went up the stairs ahead of Nora and came back down before Nora had finished the first floor. There are 5 bedrooms. She reported. Nora looked at her. That's a lot, Gracie said. For 2 people. Nora thought about the Arthur Wren exhibition opening in 18 months. She thought about Dr. Ferrante and Ruth Wren and the researchers who would come to work on the project, people who might need somewhere to stay for a week or a month or longer. She thought about the barn and the workshop that would go into it and the work she had in mind for it. She thought about the long table at Clara's conference room, the chairs around it, the meetings that would happen in the years ahead, the building of something that didn't exist yet and would take time and would require space. We won't always be 2 people, she said. She bought the property in June and moved in August. She hired Carl Henderson to oversee the renovation work, which turned out to be his calling in a way his previous career in commercial HVAC had not quite been. He approached the farmhouse with the dedication of someone given a meaningful project and spent 4 months making it exactly what it needed to be, which was itself but better. The chest of drawers went into Nora's bedroom in the farmhouse, against the wall under the window that faced the ridge. The water stains on the top surface remained. The electrical tape placeholder remained on the 3rd drawer. These were not things to be fixed. They were things to be kept. Gerald called once more, in June, after the final court documents had been filed and the trust transfer was complete, and there was nothing left to contest. His voice had a different quality this time. The warmth was gone entirely, not replaced by coldness, but by something more honest, which was the tone of someone who has run out of performances and is left with whatever is underneath. "I want you to know I'm not going to keep fighting this," he said. "I know," Nora said. "Dad never told us about any of it." No. She thought about why Henry hadn't told them, the documented reasons, the financial history, the loan that was never repaid. She thought about something else, something Henry had written that she had returned to many times since November. He had said that Patricia and Gerald would not do with the collection what it needed to be done. Not that they were bad people. Not that they were failures. That they would not understand what it required. So understanding what something required was different from being a good person. It was a specific kind of attention that some people had for some things, and other people didn't. And it had nothing to do with intelligence or character, and everything to do with what a person cared enough about to develop. "He loved you," Nora said. "He loved both of you. He just knew what he knew." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do something with it," he said. "The collection." "Yes. Something good? And something I hope is good," she said. "That's the goal." He said goodbye, and she didn't expect to hear from him again for a long time, and that was okay. She bore no specific ill will toward Gerald or Patricia. They had done what people did when they were afraid of losing something they'd been counting on. They had fought with the tools they had. They had lost because the foundation they'd been fighting from was not as solid as they'd believed. And they had believed it was solid because they had not understood what their father was actually building. Henry had not been hiding from his children when he kept the trust secret. He had been protecting something that he understood, and they did not. And he had been waiting for the person who would understand it, and he had found her. In August, the week before the movers came with the farmhouse furniture, Nora drove to Millbrook on a Sunday afternoon and parked in front of Henry's old house on Sycamore Street. The young family from Nashville had moved in already. There were toys in the front yard, and a welcome mat on the porch that hadn't been there before, and a bicycle leaning against the railing. She sat in her truck and looked at it. She did not go to the door. She had not known these people, and she did not need to. She sat in her truck and looked at the house for a while, where the Victorian with the porch where Henry had sat in the evenings, and she let herself feel what she felt about it, which was grief and gratitude in equal measure. And then she drove home. The exhibition opened in October, 14 months after Nora had first found the panel. The Vanderbilt Fine Arts Gallery had devoted its largest space to it, and Dr. Ferrante had built something she was genuinely proud of. Nora could see that in her face at the opening, the particular pride of someone who has been given the resources to do the work they actually wanted to do. The Cromwell painting had been cleaned and was displayed in the center of the main room, lit the way Dr. Ferrante had specified, with the autumn light in the river valley rendered at its full depth now, the layers of pigment visible in the way they hadn't been in the storage room. It looked different on a gallery wall than it had in Franklin. Not different in itself, but different in relation to the people looking at it, the gallery visitors and the art critics, and the 3 journalists who had covered the story of the lost Cromwell and the collection, and Henry and Arthur. Clara came to the opening with her husband. Ruth Wren came from Columbia in her 20-year-old Buick. Dr. Ferrante gave a speech that mentioned Arthur Wren and Henry Calloway by name, and described the chain of custody, the 60 years of careful stewardship, and in language that was academic in structure, and genuinely moved in delivery. Gracie stood in front of the painting for a long time, the way Nora had stood in the storage room, with the focused attention she brought to things she was seriously considering. Oliver was not with her, having been deemed inappropriate for a gallery opening. "Why is it worth so much money?" she asked finally. Nora thought about how to answer this. Because it's beautiful in a way that's specific, she said. Not just beautiful in general, but beautiful in a particular way that took a particular person a particular amount of time to understand and learn to put on canvas. And because that person died before they could make very many, and because it was almost lost, and instead someone saved it. Gracie looked at her, like Great-Grandpa Henry. Yes, Nora said. Like him. Gracie looked back at the painting. I think he would have liked knowing it was here, she said, where people could see it. I think he would have too. It was cold going home, the October cold that had a different quality from winter cold, a reminder rather than an arrival. Nora drove with the heater on, and Gracie asleep in the passenger seat, with her head against the window, and the dark Tennessee hills moved past the windows on both sides of the road. She thought about everything that had happened in the 11 months since she'd driven this road in the other direction, on 90 minutes to the estate attorney's conference room, to sit at the end of a long table in a navy blazer and take the thing everyone else had dismissed. She thought about Terence Voss on her porch with his buyers and his generous offers and his calculated warmth. She thought about the four-way split that had slipped out of Gerald's voice before he could recalibrate. She thought about Beverly Marsh saying sensitive, and Patricia's hands folded on the conference table with the practiced stillness of someone who had decided to feel nothing and was succeeding at it for the moment. She thought about Judge McAllister reading Arthur Wren's letters in silence, taking them seriously, understanding without being told that what she was holding was evidence of something that mattered. She thought about Ruth Wren driving to Nashville in a borrowed blazer with a box of letters on the passenger seat because she wanted the right person to have them. She thought about Henry calling every Sunday at noon, about the specific certainty in his voice, about the way he'd said you're doing fine and meant it as information rather than comfort, because he was always watching, always paying attention, always maintaining the careful custody of things he loved. And she had been the thing he loved most carefully. She had not known it fully while he was alive, or not known the dimensions of it, the way you rarely knew the full dimensions of being loved until you encountered what had been built for you in the spaces you weren't watching. He had built a lot in the spaces she wasn't watching. She turned onto the county road that ran along the ridge, and the farmhouse appeared below, the white clapboard, lit from inside, the porch light on in the blue dark evening. Carl Henderson had put a new railing on the porch 2 weeks ago, a good match for the original, sturdy and straight and ready for whatever came next. She parked and turned off the engine and sat for a moment. She thought about the chest of drawers upstairs in her bedroom, the water stains, the electrical tape, the panel in the third drawer, closed now, the latch secure. Nothing inside it anymore. So the documents were with Clara and in the trust records, and at the Vanderbilt Gallery in the exhibition notes, and in a dozen places where they were safe and cared for and known. But she had been thinking about what to put in the panel now. Not documents, not legal materials. Something else. She had been thinking about it for weeks and had arrived at an answer she thought was right. She would put a letter there, her own letter, addressed to Gracie, and to be found when Gracie was old enough to clean furniture with care, to press the corners and find the latch, to hold what she found and understand what it meant. She would write about Henry and Arthur and the chain of custody that had reached her in a November afternoon. She would write about what it meant to hold something carefully because it mattered, not because you were paid to, and not because other people would recognize the value, and not because it was easy. She would write about the difference between ownership and responsibility, and about trust as a verb, an ongoing action, not a legal instrument, but a practice sustained by choice. She would write about Gracie, about the peppermint candies, and the formal thank you, and Henry's eyes at the corners. About Oliver and the Penguin Project, and the way Gracie moved through rooms, pressing her hand against walls, asking questions, paying attention. She would write, "He was right about me," and she would write, "I am right about you," and she would write, "Clean the furniture carefully. The best things are hidden where only someone who loves them properly will look." She would fold it in thirds and seal it in an envelope and put it behind the panel and press the latch closed, and the chest would sit in whatever room it occupied, water-stained and worth $200 in any room that didn't know what it held. And when Gracie was ready, she would find it. Not because she was told to, because she loved the thing and took it seriously and cleaned it with care, because that was who she was, because Nora was right about her. She got out of the car and lifted Gracie's sleeping weight and carried her inside, her daughter's breath warm against her neck, and climbed the stairs to the room with the 5 bedrooms and the ridge view and all the space she hadn't known she was building toward. She tucked Gracie in and stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went to her bedroom and sat on the floor in front of the chest of drawers, the way she had sat that November afternoon, and put her hand on the wood. It was cool under her palm, dark-grained and damaged and permanent. She thought about Henry saying, "Not broken. Just needs a placeholder until I find the right hardware." She had found it. The right hardware had been there all along, inside the panel, waiting for the right hands. It was hers now. The responsibility of it, and the beauty of it, and the long chain of careful people who had carried it forward to this moment. She pressed her palm against the wood. She thought, "I've got it, Henry." She thought, "I've got it." Outside the window, the October stars were coming out over the ridge, the same stars that had been visible from Henry's porch on Sycamore Street, and from the storage room in Franklin, and from wherever Arthur Wren had sat in Mississippi in 1963 after buying a painting because the light was right. The same stars, patient and permanent, bearing witness the way stars bore witness, without judgment and without expectation, simply by being there in the dark, constant above everything that changed below them. Nora stayed on the floor until she was ready to get up. Then she got up and found a legal pad and sat down at the farmhouse kitchen table and began to write her daughter a letter. "Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story."